A very rich person is started off a plane by an airline steward for no great explanation. It seems like the finish of the story right yet. After 20 minutes he claims the whole aircraft. How did this happen? You will not accept what he did next. Before we start the story, leave a remark underneath and tell us where you're watching from today. We love hearing from individuals from one side of the planet to the other, and on the off chance that you partake in this story, don't neglect to hit that buy in button so you never pass up additional unfathomable stories like this one. It was a customary evening at New York's JFK Air Terminal when a rich money manager wearing a flawless suit approached door 23 for his trip to London. He wasn't a man who captivated everyone, no ostentatious gems or then again noisy conduct. Truth be told, he appeared to be excessively standard for somebody worth billions. He had the vibe of somebody who was accustomed to going in style, however didn't have to parade at his name. Charles Blackwood, an isolated tycoon whose fortune was based on tech organizations, ventures and a string of high-profile acquisitions. Nobody in the packed terminal would have speculated he was a man who could adjust the direction of a whole carrier with simply a call. As the travelers loaded onto the plane, Charles was one of the first to subside into his seat in business class. His flight was smooth like each and every other one he had taken until the second he experienced an airline steward who was having an especially extreme day. Her name was Jenna, and she had been working with the aircraft for north of 5 years. She was youthful, sharp and anxious to do everything by the book. However, that midday her day had been loaded with postponements and objections, and her understanding was running slim. When she arrived at Charles' line, she halted and made a solicitation that appeared to be completely normal. "Sir, you'll have to switch off your telephone and put it in standalone mode," Jenna said in a tone that was more legitimate than considerate. It wasn't anything strange. Past trauma centers were helped to remember exactly the same thing each time they loaded onto a plane. However, for some reason Charles, who had been lost in a record of reports on his tablet, hadn't seen the declaration. He looked up at her and gestured as most travelers would, ready to do his taunt anyway. Something turned out badly at that point. Jenna, who had been feeling the squeeze the entire day, confused his deferred reaction as rebellion. "Sir, I requested that you switch off your gadget. You want to adhere to the guidelines," she said, this time with more power. Charles took a gander at her, his demeanor quiet, nearly entertained. He didn't represent a second like gauging his choices. He could have done without to cause a ruckus, particularly while voyaging, yet something about the way she addressed him annoyed him. "I'm sorry," he said, "I didn't acknowledge it was an issue. I'll switch it off now." However, Jenna wasn't having it. Perhaps it was the pressure of the long shift or simply the power she felt at that time, yet she won't withdraw. "You're not viewing this in a serious way, sir. I must request that you leave the plane," she said, her voice more harsh than before. Charles gazed at her briefly, unfit to accept what he was hearing. He traversed the globe for business, and nobody had at any point addressed him like this, yet he wasn't the sort to cause a ruckus. He stood up, got his pack, furthermore strolled off the plane without a word. Different travelers watched in dismay, uncertain of what was occurring. In any case, not a single one of them said anything. It was only after he ventured into the terminal, still in dismay, that Charles acknowledged exactly the way in which serious the circumstance was. Jenna had gone excessively far, and presently Charles won't allow it to slide. He wasn't about to get on another flight. No, he was going to ensure this episode didn't be ignored. What occurred next would send shockwaves through the flight industry, and nobody, not even the aircraft's top chiefs, might have anticipated it. As Charles remained in the terminal, his telephone rang. It was a confidential number, one he perceived yet hadn't heard from in some time. The voice on the opposite end was quiet, however direct, a sharp differentiation to the rising disappointment he felt. It was his attorney Gregory, who had dealt with the vast majority of his business undertakings for a really long time. "Charles," Gregory said, "I know you could do without to engage in these sorts of things. However, I heard what happened. Do you maintain that I should deal with it, or would you like to manage it yourself?" Charles didn't answer immediately. He was all the while handling the occasions. He had been slighted in the least difficult, most open manner conceivable by an airline steward. Surprisingly, the vast majority would have ignored it or allowed it to go unnoticed, yet Charles wasn't. Similar to a great many people, his life had been a progression of determined moves, and each difficulty, regardless of how little, had forever been an open door. This time anyway, it wasn't about benefit or exchange. It was about power, about saying something that would be difficult to overlook. "I'm not inspired by conciliatory sentiments or a discount for the burden," Charles answered, his voice quiet yet with an edge of Assurance: I need control, I need to possess the carrier, I need it in my name. Get it going. Gregory stopped briefly, like attempting to measure whether Singe was serious. You need to possess it. The entire organization. Charles let out a calm laugh. Yes, Gregory, the situation I'm done being underrated. Gregory had seen Charles take enormous actions before, yet this one was different. It was private, yet that's what Gregory knew. Whether anybody could pull this off, it was Charles. He immediately got to work reaching key sorts in the business world and connecting with the right individuals to begin the cycle with. Inside the space of minutes, the legitimate groups were prepared and an arrangement was being kicked off. As Charles remained there, the underlying dissatisfaction started to blur. It was supplanted with a virus-determined feeling of reason. He won't simply allow this occurrence to go unnoticed, rather he was going to transform it into an open door that would profoundly impact the aircraft business. He realized it would be difficult. There would be obstruction, the aircraft's chiefs would retaliate, and there would be fights in court to confront. Yet Charles had the assets, the impact, and the purpose to see this through. His abundance had forever been his safeguard. However, presently it would have been his weapon, and when this was over, the aircraft that had embarrassed him would be in his hands. Under an hour after the fact, Charles was once again at his confidential office in Manhattan, sitting before a heap of papers that meant close to nothing to him any longer. He'd experienced many agreements, consolidations, and acquisitions throughout the long term, yet not at all like this. Wasn't tied in with purchasing organizations for benefit, it was tied in with taking control such that nobody could at any point neglect. Gregory was on the telephone again, refreshing Charles on the advancement. I have your offers prepared, he said. We're purchasing up portions of the aircraft presently. I've proactively got the monetary support arranged and we'll be ready to push this through very quickly. However, we must move quickly. Once the media finds out about this, things will get convoluted. Charles gestured. However, Gregory couldn't see him. I couldn't care less how convoluted it gets. I need to ensure the principal thing the chief hears tomorrow. First thing is my name. Ensure the deal is firm, no pulling out. He reclined in his seat, watching out the window at the rambling city underneath, feeling a chilly assurance. Get comfortable. It wasn't just about claiming the carrier, it was tied in with making an impression on anybody who figured they could deal with him like an outcast, like somebody who could be excused or overlooked. The flight orderly Jenna had no clue about what she'd began. The lawful group dealt with the late evening, poring over the airline stock choices, pieces of the pie and corporate design. Charles' attorneys settled on decisions to significant financial backers, applying strain to sell their stakes. In the meantime, Gregory's group was coordinating the last stage, a monstrous acquisition of stocks that would empower Charles to make a antagonistic takeover. The clock was ticking. However, Charles had no question it would work. He'd constructed his realm on speedy, definitive moves, and this would be the same by the opportunity. The morning came. The arrangement was nearly fixed. Gregory called again, his voice tense, however loaded up with certainty. It stunned the airline top managerial staff. Is as of now fully on guard. We've caused the last proposition and they'll need to answer inside the space of hours. As of now, it's a matter of hanging tight for them to either acknowledge or go down battling. Charles stood up, his mind previously working out the following move. This was just the starting. Regardless of whether they retaliated, they were at that point excessively far behind. He had all that set up: control of an adequate number of offers, lawful influence, furthermore a procedure that would pressure them to reveal more than was prudent. However, there was something different that waited to him. The flight specialist Jenna. Charles couldn't resist the opportunity to ponder how irrelevant she probably thought he was. The point at which she dismissed him from that plane, she had no clue about who he truly was, and soon she would see exactly the way that off base she was. Charles strolled over to the window, looking as the city began to awaken underneath him. He felt a surge of fulfillment. This wasn't just about assuming control over an carrier, it was tied in with revamping the guidelines, about showing the world that even the littlest of affronts could transform into a game-changing move. And with respect to the aircraft, it was just about as great as his. The following not many hours were a haze of calls, gatherings, and quick-fire messages. Charles scarcely rested, his brain fixed exclusively on the one thing that made a difference: presently claiming the carrier. He realized this would not have been a fast triumph. The aircraft's leaders wouldn't turn over effectively. However, he had the assets, and that's just the beginning. Significantly, the drive to outlive them. By early in the day, the principal news reports hit Puzzling tycoon makes spade for significant carrier following public occurrence. The titles read the anecdote about his conflict with the airline steward had proactively advanced toward the media, and true to form it had created a ruckus. What had begun as a basic occurrence on the flight was currently public information, yet Charles couldn't have cared less about the press. He was at that point moving past it. His legal counselors were settling on decisions to the aircraft's board, individuals clarifying that his proposition was non-debatable. The sum he was presenting for their portions was sufficiently significant to drive them into a corner. The carrier's top chiefs, drove by President David Clarkson, were currently scrambling. They hadn't seen this approaching a man they accepted for a moment that was simply one more traveler on a business flight had ended up being a strong power with the capacity to move the overall influence freely inside the corporate workplaces of the carrier. Disarray started to unfurl. Clarkson, an accomplished president who had driven the organization, tossed highs and lows for north of 10 years, was in a condition of mistrust. Who is this person, he murmured to his group, gazing at the screen showing the unexpected flood in stock buys. How did he gain this much control so quick? The chiefs crouched together, difficult to sort out some way to obstruct the securing. They had proactively started to bring in their own lawful groups, looking for ways of testing the bid. Yet as they dug further, obviously Charles had arranged each step of this. The offers he purchased were secured and legitimately, and the provisions of the takeover were impermeable. There was no chance to get out. In the meantime, Charles sat back in his office watching the tempest unfurl from his glass-framed work area. He wasn't concerned. He realized it was inevitable before the carrier's board would be compelled to acknowledge the proposition, the fights in court, the obstruction. It was all essential for the game. However, Charles wasn't simply playing for the momentary. He had greater plans at this point. It wasn't just about assuming control over a carrier, it was tied in with communicating something specific, one that nobody could disregard. He believed that them should realize that he was not somebody to be undervalued, and that airline steward Jenna, she couldn't really understand the far-reaching influence her activities had gotten underway in the calm of his office. As he watched the dealings unfurl on his PC screen, Charles grinned to himself. This wasn't simply an agreement. It was private, and in only 2 or 3 few hours the world would know it. The carrier's once strong chiefs would be compelled to sit opposite him at a table, contribution him control of their organization. Yet there was one last piece of the riddle. Charles realized that when the arrangement was concluded, he'd make his next move. He won't simply take control discreetly. No, he needed to make a explanation to the whole world, to each individual who had at any point questioned him, and he had the ideal arrangement. When the clock struck early afternoon, Charles got the call he had been sitting tight for. It was Gregory again, his voice consistent, however bound with earnestness. It's done. The board has consented to the arrangement. They've approved the securing you currently formally own the carrier. Charles reclined in his seat, a rush of fulfillment washing over him. He had expected it, obviously. However, hearing the words affirmed it. The aircraft that had embarrassed him on that plane was currently his. The arrangement had gone through easily. Every one of the restless evenings, the calls, the strain, it had taken care of. He had won. Yet indeed, even as the heaviness of his prosperity got comfortable, a piece of him felt that this was only the starting. Great, Charles said, his voice quiet. Currently, ensure the media gets the official statement. I need the whole world to realize who possesses this carrier. It's the ideal opportunity for them to realize who they're truly managing. There was a brief quiet on the opposite stopping point before Gregory answered, you sure you need to offer a public expression like that? It will cause disturbances. The press is as of now on it with the account of what occurred on the plane, and presently this I mean you're stirring things up. Charles grinned. However, it was anything but a grin of satisfaction. It was a grin of determined purpose. Precisely. Let them talk, let them guess. However, in all actuality, this isn't just about the carrier, it's about me, and about making an impression on anybody figures they can make me look little. They Need to comprehend that nobody disregards me. Not in that frame of mind as the call finished. Charles felt a peculiar blend of fulfillment and expectation. He had pulled off something that nobody believed was conceivable, something that would be discussed for quite a long time, yet there was as yet one last step. He won't simply allow the media to publicity this up and leave discreetly. No, he planned to ensure that his name was perpetually attached to the carrier, that his proprietorship would leave an enduring impression. Inside the space of hours the public statement was out and the story hit the titles like rapidly spreading fire tycoon Charles Blackwood buys carrier name after open conflict on flight. The title shouted. Media sources from everywhere the world were covering the story, each with their own twist. Some called it a demonstration of vengeance, others a business virtuoso move, yet nobody had anticipated what might occur next. The inclusion of the takeover was wherever significant information stations were circulating film of the episode on the plane, followed by shots of Charles standing unhesitatingly outside the aircraft's central command before the press. He wasn't simply the one who purchased a carrier, he was the one who had been disregarded and transformed that insolence into a billion-dual procurement. However, the genuine shock came sometime thereafter when Charles advanced toward the corporate workplaces. He had one last venture to play. It wasn't sufficient to simply claim the carrier. Now he needed to ensure that each single individual in that building knew precisely who was in control. He strolled into the meeting room where the leftover leaders, including President David Clarkson, were accumulated for a crisis meeting. The unease in the room was overwhelming. They had been hoping to talk about how to deal with the takeover, yet they hadn't expected this. Charles, wearing his typical sharp suit, strolled to the front of the room with a quiet, practically easygoing disposition. Respectable men, he said, his voice slicing through the air. I trust we can begin the gathering. Currently I might want to start by presenting myself. I'm the new proprietor of carrier name and I've come to make a scarcely any progressions. The chiefs plainly shook, traded awkward looks. Clarkson attempted to get it together, rising up to shake Charles' hand. Mr. Blackwood, he said, his voice tight. We didn't anticipate this. However, we'll give our best for guarantee the change is smooth. Charles didn't answer with the expected merriments, rather he gazed straight toward Clarkson, his eyes steely and enduring. I don't require smooth, Charles said straight. I really want control. I didn't buy this carrier to lounge around. I got it since I was slighted, and presently it's time for you all to comprehend who holds the power here. The room went quiet. Clarkson, presently apparently tense, gestured. However, Charles could perceive that he wasn't completely getting a handle on the magnitude of what had simply happened. It wasn't business, it was individual. Charles had taken his action and nobody planned to remove that from him. He went to leave the room, yet before he did he gave one last chilling comment. I believe that you lulled your occupations for the rest of the week. After that we'll examine new administration. With it he left, leaving the room in dazed quiet. External, the media was previously hanging tight for him. Journalists yelled questions as Charles cleared his path through the group, his face made. He was finished with casual chit-chat. He had greater prepares, and this was only the start of what he planned to fabricate. As he drove away from the structure, he really wanted to grin. The airline steward who had dismissed him from that plane, she could always remember this day, and neither would any other individual. The following hardly any days were a hurricane for Charles. Media sources were humming with the subtleties of his startling obtaining of the carrier, and wherever he went individuals appeared to be discussing it. The media inclusion was persistent. However, Charles wouldn't fret. He flourished in the bedlam. It wasn't just about the takeover any longer, it was about control. He had made a move that nobody saw coming, and presently everybody was scrambling to get up to speed inside the carrier's central command. The leaders were in harm control mode. Chief David Clarkson and the board individuals, every one of whom had been caught unaware by Charles' forceful takeover, were staying at work longer than required to change in accordance with the new reality. Yet Charles wasn't keen on their expressions of remorse or their consolations. He had previously clarified that he wasn't there to get along. On the third day after the obtaining, Charles called a meeting with his new supervisory crew. The room was loaded with a portion of the carrier's top chiefs, the greater part of them awkward with the unexpected change in administration. Charles anyway appeared totally calm. He sat at the head of the table, a certain grin playing all the rage as he glanced around at the restless countenances before him. I'm certain some of you have questions, he started, his voice consistent and ordering. However, previously we get into all that, let me make one thing clear. Haven't arrived to run an organization the way it's been run for quite a long time. This carrier is going to be different. It will be proficient, it will be productive, and most significantly it will regard individuals from the beginning to the travelers. The room was still as Charles talked. Nobody thought about intruding on the air was thick with strain as they stood by to see what he would agree that next. I've heard a ton of objections about this organization's way of life. He kept inclining forward marginally. I've heard that representatives are exhausted and overlooked. I've heard that clients are dealt with as they don't make any difference that will change, and it's going to change right presently. We won't be the carrier that individuals fear flying with. We will be the aircraft individuals pick, since they realize we care about their experience. And assuming any of you imagine that is an excessive amount to inquire, I propose you begin searching for another occupation, since I don't endure unremarkableness. The leaders traded awkward looks. Charles could recognize the disquiet easily, however he didn't care. This was his show now, and the time had come to establish the vibe. He wasn't keen on playing the political games that had tormented the aircraft for quite a long time. He was here to make changes and make them quick. As the gathering went on, Charles illustrated a progression of clearing changes. He discussed smoothing out activities, further developing client care, and, surprisingly, reducing superfluous expenses. Yet the most significant change he reported was the rebuilding of the supervisory group. He wouldn't hesitate to make adversaries individuals who had permitted the carrier to deteriorate, who had allowed things to slide for a really long time, would be gone. The way of life of smugness was over. While the gathering at last wrapped up, Charles stood up, flagging the finish of the meeting as the leaders recorded out of the room. The majority of them strolled with their heads down, plainly shaken by the manner in which Charles had turned all that topsy-turvy in only a couple of days. Yet Charles wasn't worried about their uneasiness. He had come to his meaningful conclusion. Nobody would challenge him, nobody would deal with him like no one important, except for there was as yet the question of Jenna, the flight specialist who had begun this entire chain of occasions. Charles had pondered her consistently since the episode. At first it had been a transitory idea, something that irritated him yet he could get over. Yet presently, after all that he had done, he understood she was something beyond an irritation. She was an image of how individuals misjudged him. She had no clue about who she'd been managing, and Charles wasn't the sort of man who might let that slide. He didn't as yet know what he would do about Jenna. However, one thing was sure: she wouldn't get off simple. This didn't involve vengeance, it was tied in with making a point on the planet Charles worked in. Nobody got to affront him and leave without outcomes. As the day wore on, Charles sat in his office investigating the last subtleties of the aircraft's new arrangements. He was at that point thinking ahead, arranging the subsequent stages. The media inclusion of the takeover had proactively begun to blur, yet not set in stone, to move the energy along. He believed everybody should realize that this wasn't simply a one-time bargain. This was the start of something a lot greater. He had his sights set on more acquisitions, more power and more impact, and nobody was going to hold him up. Yet as Charles directed his concentration toward into the aircraft's future, one idea waited in his subconscious: Jenna, the one who had kicked him off that plane. She had no clue about the amount she had steered her own existence with that one choice, and Charles would ensure she recollected that. As the days passed, Charles' grasp on the aircraft became more tight. The general transforms he had carried out were starting to produce results. The corporate climate was moving from one of carelessness to one of high-stakes productivity. A few representatives were distrustful, uncertain of what the new authority would mean for their everyday lives, except numerous others invited the change. They could feel the contrast. Things were moving quicker, choices were being made with power, and there was an unmistakable sense that the organization was done floating. Charles was determined in his endeavors to reshape the carrier's culture. He held week-by-week gatherings with the division heads, requesting progress reports and offering little tolerance for delays. If a utilized wasn't doing their fair share, they were immediately seen out. Charles had no capacity to bear average quality, and the outcomes started to show very quickly. Stock costs rose, consumer loyalty improved, and, surprisingly, the staff in the terminals appeared to be more roused. Yet even as he zeroed in on the everyday tasks of his new organization, one thing actually weighed intensely at the forefront of his thoughts: Jenna, the airline steward who had begun this entire adventure. Charles hadn't failed to remember her. As a matter of fact, he was unable to stop contemplating the manner in which she had treated him that day on the plane. To her he was simply one more traveler, yet to him that second had been an affront, one that he had transformed into a realm. He was unable to let it go. It was clear now that this wasn't just about claiming a carrier, it was tied in with making a statement. Jenna, the youthful airline steward. He had figured she could embarrass him. However, presently Charles was accountable for her reality, her beneficiary line, her organization, her work. He didn't have to act in that frame of mind of outrage. No, this was going to be determined. He had endlessly time, as he probably was aware very much was his most remarkable partner. Charles was known for his understanding, for his capacity to hang tight for the ideal second, and that second he understood would come soon. He had been given a stage to reshape everything, and he planned to use it to ensure everybody in the organization grasped the outcomes of misjudge in him. Yet Charles wasn't going to move against Jenna aimlessly. He needed to ensure her example was one that would stick for her as well as for everybody watching. He began to discreetly explore her experience, her vocation history, the little subtleties that the vast majority wouldn't see. It didn't take long for his group to find the data he really wanted. Jenna had moved gradually up from a little provincial carrier, taking some work at this significant organization with fantasies about progressing, of building a vocation. She wasn't anybody unique, not yet at any rate. Yet what interested Charles was her propensity for selfishness, her conviction that she could pursue choices disregarding the greater picture. He discovered that she had been with the carrier for several years. However, in that brief time frame she had figured out how to move into a position where she felt engaged to challenge a tycoon. That wasn't the sort of conduct Charles endured. Nobody reserved the option to particularly sabotage him. Not somebody who had scarcely shown what them can do in the business. Thus Charles formulated an arrangement. It wasn't really necessary to focus on terminating her on the spot or making her a public display. No, that would be excessively simple. Rather, he would set her in a position where she would need to recognize the power he currently held. He would cause her to comprehend in no unsure terms that her activities had outcomes. Yet this would not have been some speedy rushed retaliation. Charles wasn't keen on whimsical vengeance. He was imagining greater possibilities. He trained his HR office to unobtrusively assemble all the data they could on Jenna's expert history inside the organization, her presentation surveys, her disciplinary records, any grumblings documented against her, and, surprisingly, her associations with other staff individuals, assuming there was whatever might be utilized to scrutinize her skill or her capacity to go about her business. Charles would ensure it became known. Yet the key piece of his arrangement was the way he would move toward Jenna when the opportunity arrived. When he at last chose to take his action, it would be before her friends, before her partners, where she would feel the heaviness of the circumstance. It wasn't just about reproving her, it was tied in with showing her and everybody watching that Charles Blackwood was not somebody to be crossed. He needed to ensure that Jenna knew precisely who was accountable for the aircraft. Presently, the same way she had embarrassed him by dismissing him from that plane, he would make sure her profession at the carrier could never go back. However, he would do it in a manner that would leave her with no getaway from. He would eliminate her from the organization with an accuracy that would make it clear to everybody in the room that he was dependably 3 strides ahead, and when it was over, nobody, particularly not Jenna, could at any point question his power again. It wasn't well before Charles' arrangement began coming to fruition. His group had accumulated all the data they required about Jenna, her surveys, her experience with the carrier, and the various objections about her mentality from travelers. However, Jenna had figured out how to conceal a portion of her inadequacies behind her sharp non-rubbish outside. Charles could see the breaks. It was all there. An airline steward who thought she was unquestionably sound, an individual who accepted her position, gave her the right to pursue choices without grasping the full results. Yet time was on Charles' side. Race to act. He needed to give. Now was the ideal time to stew, to guarantee that when he took his action it would be the right second, the one that would hit hardest. The last thing he needed was for anybody to believe that his choice was careless or in light of feeling. This was about methodology, and as consistently Charles was able to sit tight for the ideal time, days transformed into a week, and while the corporate rebuilding went on under his careful attention, he started to zero in additional on-gen developments. He watched out for the in-flight plans, observing her movements and her tasks. He didn't need to cause it too clear, didn't need her to feel observed. However, he expected to guarantee that when he acted she wouldn't get any opportunity to contend right out of it. At last the day came. Charles had simply gotten back to the workplace after a speedy gathering with one of his monetary accomplices when he was informed that Jenna would be working a high-profile flight, the sort of flight that got consideration from both the media and industry insiders. It was an ideal open door. Charles realized this was the Second, he had been hanging tight for the flight would be a defining moment, a public exhibition, on the off chance that he could utilize it to his advantage. Everybody in the aircraft would comprehend the outcomes of challenging him. The press had previously been observing intently, following the account of the carrier's takeover and its quick change under Charles' administration. He knew that if, assuming he took his action now, the media would be there to get each second to enhance the message he needed to send. Charles didn't sit around idly. He called his head of tasks and taught him to sort out for a group of PR delegates to be available on the flight for good measure. Things opened up to the world surprisingly. He likewise told his security group to tactfully screen what is happening, guaranteeing everything worked out as expected. Jenna wouldn't understand what hit her. That night, as the plane ready for departure, Charles showed up at the aircraft's terminal, his presence telling consideration even among the air terminal's clamoring action. He didn't should be conspicuous or flaunt his power, was perceived without the requirement for additional showcase. Jenna was there similarly as he expected, and she was in contention with one more group part about a few somewhat late changes to the flight plan. Plainly she was baffled, and Charles knew precisely how to utilize this for his potential benefit. This was the one who had barely cared about dismissing him from a plane only days sooner, who had rushed to deprecate him. Charles strolled tranquilly through the terminal, his eyes checking the room until they locked onto her. Jenna was busy conversing with a couple of other team individuals. When she saw him, the acknowledgement was moment. She froze briefly. There was a flash of frenzy in her eyes, however at that point she immediately recovered, fixing up and offering a considerate, assuming that stressed grin. "Mr. Blackwood," she expressed, attempting to sound proficient. However, there was no mixing up the pressure in her voice. "Is there something I can accomplish for you?" Charles didn't return her hello with the typical merriments. He didn't have to, rather he looked at her dead without flinching. Furthermore, talked in a quiet, controlled tone that was some way or another more scary than any yell might have been. "I trust there's something we really want to talk about, Jenna," he said, his words slow and think. "I've been made mindful of your way of behaving during our last communication, and I figure you ought to realize I don't endure individuals who figure they can disregard me without outcomes." Jenna's face withered somewhat. Yet, she didn't recoil. She attempted to conceal her disquiet with a constrained grin, yet Charles could see the strain in her pose. "I didn't," she started, yet he cut her off with a solitary signal, his finger raised as though to quiet her. "You went with a decision," Charles said immovably, "a decision that was ill-bred not exclusively to me yet to the whole organization. You believe you're over the guidelines that finishes today." He stopped, letting the heaviness of his words settle between them. The room was quiet. The encompassing group individuals had eased off somewhat, detecting that something critical was going to unfurl. Jenna was trapped in the spotlight now, and she realized it. "I've previously spoken with HR," Charles proceeded, taking effect right now. "You are feeling better of your obligations with carrier name. I don't require somebody with your mentality addressing this organization." He let the absolution of his assertion wait prior to adding, "Your flight will be taken care of unobtrusively, yet I maintain that you should comprehend this. The manner in which you treated me wasn't simply a minor occurrence, it was a proclamation, and presently I'm making mine." Jenna's face reddened with outrage and humiliation. However, she wouldn't even come close to answering. What might she at some point say? She knew just as he did that this was definitely not a straightforward terminating. It was a determined public embarrassment. Her pride wouldn't let her show shortcoming. However, she could feel the floor moving underneath her. Charles gone to leave. However, before he did, he gave her one final look. "I genuinely want to believe that you gain something from this," he said icily. "It's not just about what you make, it happens about who you do it to, and you will always remember who you crossed without one more word." Charles left the terminal, leaving behind a paralyzed and embarrassed Jenna, who stood frozen in place as the entryway clicked shut behind him. He realized he had come to his meaningful conclusion, not just to her, however, to everybody watching, and before long the media would be brimming with tales about the baffling quick destruction of one of the carrier's top workers. Yet the greater story was as yet unfurling. Charles Blackwood was a man to be dreaded, and nobody, regardless how little their job, would dare challenge him again. The following couple of days brought a tornado of media consideration. The narrative of Jenna's abrupt and extremely open termination terminating spread rapidly. Media sources, virtual entertainment, and even travelers who had been on the flight started to share the subtleties of what had happened. Some called it merciless, others called it supported. However, one thing was clear: Charles Blackwood had come to his meaningful conclusion. The message was straightforward: keep in mind him. For Charles, this wasn't about retribution, it was tied in with starting a trend he wanted everybody in the organization and, surprisingly, the business on the loose to comprehend that his assertion was last. Nobody would dare treat him like a normal man once more, and keeping in mind that the media kept on covering Jenna's ruin, Charles stayed zeroed in on the greater picture, merging his power and guaranteeing that the carrier's new bearing was solidly set up behind shut entryways. The board, individuals and chiefs who had once been anxious about the progressions, were beginning to see the advantages of Charles' administration under his direction. The carrier stock was climbing consistently and its functional productivity was working on quicker than anybody had expected. There were still doubters, obviously, however the outcome settled everything. Charles didn't sit around lolling in the greatness of his triumph. However, he realized that the world wouldn't be happy with only one strong action. They were at that point starting to neglect Jenna's name was beginning to blur from the titles, and the public's consideration was turning somewhere else. However, Charles had an arrangement to keep them watching, something that would harden his situation as an amazing powerhouse. That is the point at which he chose to hold a company-wide meeting, one that would act as both a vital update and an exceptionally open sign of his position. The whole supervisory crew and key staff individuals were welcome to go to, including the people who had been acquired by the past initiative. Charles had continuously had faith in being immediate, and today he wanted to show them exactly the way that serious he was. The day of the gathering showed up, and the room was loaded with chief staff and key figures from all divisions. The temperament was eager indeed, even somewhat tense as everybody sat down uncertain of what's in store. They realized the organization had changed under Charles' initiative. However, nobody could anticipate what he would do next. When Charles strolled into the room, the air moved. He was a man who deserved admiration, and his presence alone caused everybody to sit up straighter. There was no terrific entry, no showy acting skill. He essentially strolled to the front, stood tall, and tended to the room. "Great morning," he said, his voice quiet. "Be that as it may, firm, I don't have to let you know all the way in which far this organization has come. Somewhat recently you've seen the outcomes. We're moving in the correct course. However, haven't arrived to discuss numbers today. I'm here to discuss guidelines." He stopped, allowing the word to linger palpably briefly. "Prior to proceeding, when I purchased this carrier, it wasn't only for the resources or the stock or the extravagant planes. It was on the grounds that I realized there was undiscovered potential here. However, potential amounts to nothing in the event that we don't satisfy the principles I'm setting. This organization will be based on regard, responsibility, and difficult work. On the off chance that you're not able to meet those guidelines, you won't endure here." Straightforward as that. There was a mumble among the gathering, some gesturing in understanding, others looking uncomfortable. Charles could see the blended responses. Some were energetic about the new bearing, others were still uncertain. However, he couldn't have cared less about the uncertain ones. He was building a group of individuals who might either ascend to the to challenge or drop off the radar. This organization will be a force in the aircraft business, Charles went on. However, we will not arrive assuming we keep on permitting individuals to compromise, or on the other hand slack off. Everybody here, starting from the earliest stage to the flight participation, has to realize that we don't simply talk about greatness. We request it. On the off chance that you can't keep up, you'll be seen out. He visually connected with every leader as he talked, guaranteeing that nobody in the room could question his obligation to this vision. The room hushed up now, the heaviness of his words getting comfortable. "We've made a ton of changes as of now and will keep on doing so. I've proactively started a survey of the initiative group, and some of you will be taking on new jobs. Others—" He stopped, his eyes restricting. "We'll leave. You've gotten your opportunity to remain. You'll have to show me that you're in with no reservations. While possibly not great, I'm certain you'll find different open doors somewhere else." The unease in the room was overwhelming. No one thought for even a moment to speak. Charles had clarified there would be no space for shortcoming, no capacity to bear anybody who didn't line up with his vision. The people who had been agreeable in their old jobs, drifting along without genuine test, would need to move forward or venture out and "Something final," Charles said, his voice developing considerably more serious. "I don't need to hear additional accounts of representatives, any workers being treated with slight. This is an organization that qualities individuals, not simply benefits. I will not endure anybody sabotaging." Fat perceived the room, gestured as one. There was no space for exchange. Charles' vision was clear, and the people who had remained in the room hitherto realized that they had no real option except to fall in line. There was no getting away from his impact. As the gathering closed and individuals started to document out, Charles felt the stand by existing apart from everything else. This was the defining moment. Nobody would have the option to deny his power now. He had changed the carrier as well as the whole organization culture. His presence was unquestionable, and in the weeks to come the people who had questioned him, the people who had thought they could get by without moving forward to the test, would start to fall away. Charles wasn't about to claim this carrier. He planned to reshape it into his own picture. It was just an issue of time before everybody comprehended what had happened. The airline steward who had dismissed him from the plane would turn into an ancient history supplanted by an account of force assurance and savage achievement. Furthermore, Charles Blackwood would everlastingly be known as the one who took control of an aircraft as well as of his predetermination. As the days transformed into weeks, Charles kept on merging his control over the carrier. His vision was turning into a reality, and the progressions he guaranteed were beginning to grab hold in each side of the business. Representatives who had once drifted through their positions were presently working at full limit, roused by the feeling of dread toward being cut if they didn't satisfy the new higher guidelines. The way of life of average quality that had tormented the organization for quite a long time was being destroyed piece by piece. However, even as he delighted in the outcome of his forceful rebuilding, there was one waiting idea in his subconscious. Jenna, her face had tormented him as soon after her flight. Her resistance, her refusal to see him for who he truly was, it had pushed him to make an assertion to show her and every other person that crossing Charles Blackwood had outcomes. However, as the weeks went on, Charles started to feel that the snapshot of her discharging while at the same time fulfilling wasn't enough. It wasn't the conclusion he had expected. He expected to complete what he had begun. Jenny hadn't been simply one more worker to excuse. She had been the Flash. She was the explanation. He had assumed control over this carrier in any case, and presently he expected to ensure that she and every other person comprehended the full size of his power. It wasn't necessary to focus on vengeance any longer. It was about changing the story, about establishing his heritage, not similarly as the proprietor of an carrier, yet as a man who could shape predeterminations. He won't let Jenna's leave blur out of spotlight of the organization's fast change. No, he needed her name attached to his in a manner that would commit her, recall the error she'd made until the end of her life. Charles had the assets to get it going. With only a couple of keystrokes he could redirect anybody's future, and that is precisely what he intended to do. He had his PR group do a profound jump into Jenna's life. After she was given up, they found that, as anyone might expect, she was battling to land one more work in the business. Her standing had endured a shot. Word had gotten around about the airline steward who had crossed Charles Blackwood, yet Charles needed something other than a profession. Misfortune for her, he needed to ensure that she could at absolutely no point in the future work in the business she had cherished such a lot of. He needed to ensure that the disgrace of disregarding Charles Blackwood would follow her any place she went. That is when he took it to the powerful Charles brought in his lawful group. I believe you should ensure that Jenna can never function as a airline steward again. He trained. We're venturing out in front of the story and spread the word about certain. It's the reason she was let go. How about we utilize our own decisions to fabricate the case? The legitimate group went to work. They unobtrusively connected with industry insiders, key leaders at different carriers, and anybody who may be in a position to extend to her an employment opportunity. They painstakingly created a story that found fault decisively on Jenna's shoulders. She had challenged organization strategy, acted amateurishly, and eventually neglected to perceive the gravity of her activities. They additionally made a point to feature her past disciplinary record, painting her as a risk for any organization that would consider employing her. Charles was remembering the big picture. He didn't have to act quickly. He expected to ensure the story stuck, that the picture of Jenna as a defiant and amateurish worker turned into an extremely durable piece of her openly available report. Her standing would be discolored to the point that no one would need to risk recruiting hiring her. Meanwhile, Charles made a move to support his place of power in open. He was an expert of the media and he knew how to keep the focus on himself. He showed up at industry meetings, conversed with the press about his arrangements for the carrier's future, and kept on making intense conclusive moves that left contenders scrambling to get up to speed. Each time he talked, it was with the sort of power that meant somebody in full oversight could order. Nobody scrutinized his choices. In the background, the lawful group was working vigorously, conveying letters to different carriers, obstructing Jenna from getting some forward movement. A couple weeks after the fact, a peaceful declaration went out through the business grape plant. Previous airline steward Jenna Richards had been forever boycotted from significant carriers because of amateurishly during her work at Aircraft Name. The story spread rapidly and, however, yet wasn't shrouded in the standard news. Those in the business paid heed. The message was clear: Jenna had committed an error and presently she would pay for it. Each time somebody referenced her name, it would be trailed by the sign of why she was at this point not in the skies. In the meantime, Charles' carrier was flourishing. The rebuilding was finished. Client fulfillment was up. Worker confidence was high, or possibly the individuals who were still working in the organization's stock was hitting new highs. He had turned a negative, a basic snapshot of insolence, into a whole domain based on his vision of greatness and savagery. Charles sat in his office one evening, time checking on the most recent monetary reports, a fulfilled grin playing across his face. He had accomplished all that he had decided to do. The carrier was his. The media dreaded him, and with respect to Jenna, she was ancient history, one that would follow her until the end of her life. And that is the point at which he understood this wasn't just about assuming command over a carrier, it was tied in with making an impression on the world. Nobody, not so much as a airline steward, could challenge him and pull off it. He had demonstrated that as Charles kept on exploring the ever-extending scene of his carrier domain, he turned out to be keenly conscious about the power he had amassed, not simply monetarily. However, in the public eye he was at this point not simply a tycoon big shot who fiddled with acquisitions. He was a power in the flight business, a name that individuals perceived and dreaded like clockwork. He pursued a choice, whether it was about the carrier's future or about how to deal with a singular. It sent swells through the market and through the media. His control was outright, and he ensured everybody knew it. In the weeks following Jenna's destruction, the aircraft kept on flourishing. However, Charles wasn't happy with simply keeping things chugging along as expected. He needed more. The serious scene in the aircraft industry was ferocious, and keeping in mind that he had proactively taken a huge offer, there were still others to challenge. Charles had clarified that he wasn't keen on essentially drifting. He was hoping to rule. The following move was extension. Charles had forever been vital, and presently with the aircraft under his control, the time had come to push past its ongoing limits. His objective: to procure more modest contender, a territorial carrier that had been causing disturbances in the business. Its development potential was tremendous, yet it come up short on assets to break into the bigger market. Charles considered this to be the ideal chance to utilize his muscles. Yet again, the securing system was quick and as consistently severe. Charles didn't sit around idly arranging or messing around. He offered an arrangement that was excessively great for the more modest carriers. Board individuals to decline, and they didn't. Inside only weeks the arrangement was finished, and Charles added one more quill to his generally enhanced cap. The obtaining communicated something specific, not simply to the aircraft industry, however, to any individual who may be watching. Charles Blackwood was a man who got what he needed, and he got it quick. With this new securing, Charles quickly started making transforms. He acquired his confided-in group of leaders, the ones who had assisted him with remaking his carrier starting from the earliest stage, and together they started to coordinate the more modest aircraft's activities into his. Likewise, with each procurement there were the people who disagreed with his techniques, yet Charles didn't mind. The aircraft's culture would adjust to him or it would break. The reconciliation was not without its difficulties. There were inward power battles, conflicts over how best to join the two organizations, and developing torments as the bigger carrier gulped the more modest one. Yet Charles, ever the Visionary knew that these were basically obstacles to clear en route to the top, and clear them he did inside a couple months. The joined aircraft was more grounded than any time in recent memory. Its span was more extensive. Its standing for productivity and client administration was established, and its stock cost took all financial backers seeing the reasonable heading. Charles was accepting balanced, impelling the organization higher than ever. But notwithstanding all the victories, there was as yet one thing Charles hadn't completely tended to, the one individual whose activities had ignited this entire chain of occasions. Jenny. He had made her a model. However, presently he understood that it wasn't just about making her a useful example. It was tied in with ensuring she remained a wake-up call. For the first time in quite a while, Charles started to reconsider her, contemplating whether she had taken in her illustration yet more significantly. He started to contemplate whether there was something else to be done. He had proactively demolished her vocation in the aircraft industry, however, in a manner he understood that was only the starting. He could make sure that her name stayed connected to his into the indefinite future, and he would. It was a stormy Thursday evening at the point when Charles took a seat at his work area, a glass of scotch close by, examining his best course of action. The procurement was a triumph and the organization was thriving. However, something bothered at him, something that hadn't exactly settled. Jenna's name continued to crawl into his viewpoints like a tingle that wouldn't disappear. Charles wasn't a man who accepted occurrences. Jenna had tested him and he had dominated the competition, yet she wasn't simply any airline steward. She had pursued a cognizant decision to ignore him, to regard him like he were simply one more normal traveler, and in doing so she had gotten underway a progression of occasions that would reshape the business. He needed to guarantee that nobody would fail to remember the example he had shown her, and so Charles started to design again. It began with a basic thought: if he could make Jenna's destruction super durable, then he could ensure nobody could at any point try to cross him once more. However, he won't stop with only the carrier business. No, this would have been greater. Jenny had turned into an image of disobedience, of somebody who figured they could pull off disregarding him. Charles would guarantee that her name was everlastingly connected to his, regardless of where she went, regardless of what she attempted to do. The initial step was to guarantee that her boycott from the carrier industry remained solidly set up. He reached his legitimate group again, educating them to discreetly get the message out among contenders. His associations inside the flying world were profound, and he utilized all of them to guarantee that no aircraft, enormous or little, could at any point consider recruiting her. Nobody might want to take a chance with the terrible press or the relationship with Charles' public foe. Yet Charles wasn't halting there. He had the power, the assets, and the impact to drive things further. Through his organization of media contacts, he started to establish anecdotes about Jenna's unprofessionalism and the perilous point of reference she had set by resisting a strong industry pioneer like Charles. He made a point to underscore how her way of behaving had prompted the defeat of her vocation, and how she had cut off ties with some of the most remarkable figures in the business. As the weeks passed, Jenna turned into a wake-up call in the carrier business as well as across different media stages. Articles showed up in industry magazines, on news sites, and in business distributions, all referencing her by name, generally with the words amateurish, rebellious, and rude joined to it. The media furor encompassing her breakdown was difficult to disregard, and obviously her profession, like it was done, Charles had done it. He had guaranteed that Jenna's name would always be inseparable from disappointment in the carrier business. She could at absolutely no point in the future have the chance to remake her vocation, and he was content. His power was undisputed, his control total. Yet Charles knew that regardless of the amount he had achieved, he was unable to settle for the status quo. There was something else to be finished, more to overcome. His eyes stayed fixed not too far off, pondering the following procurement, the following extension, the following drop. Yet where it counts, he knew that no matter the amount he accomplished, it would constantly return to that second on the plane, the second when Jenna had attempted to embarrass him. That was the second that had started everything, and presently he had guaranteed that the world could never disregard it. The months that followed were a haze of triumphs, acquisitions, and public appearances. Charles' name was presently inseparable from power in the carrier business. He had turned a little apparently irrelevant snapshot of lack of respect into a build all round. However, regardless of the outward achievement, something inside Charles had started to transform. He had forever been driven, consistently had his eyes on the following objective, yet presently as he peered out over his quickly developing realm, he felt something he had had never entirely experienced before, a feeling of void. The triumph over Jenny had been sweet, however it was likewise brief. He had gotten his predominance, demonstrated his solidarity, and established his heritage, yet it didn't feel adequately like Charles had come to understand that it wasn't just about business any longer. It wasn't just about bringing in cash or taking control. Incidentally, the requirement for power had surpassed him, and presently he wound up posing an inquiry that hadn't happened to him before. Why even bother with this in the isolation of his office, encompassed by papers and reports that as of now not appeared to issue? Charles started to scrutinize his decisions. Was he doing all of this for the right reasons, or had he turned into the very thing he once detested, the merciless financial specialist who squashed everything in his way to accomplish his objectives? He spilled himself another beverage, gazing out the window at the horizon. The world had changed for him, yet had he changed for the better? It was an inquiry that waited to him, however one that he couldn't yet reply. As the days transformed into weeks, Charles wound up battling with a more profound feeling of fretfulness. The fulfillment he once felt with each new securing, each arrangement it appeared to with time his domain had extended past his most stunning dreams. However, presently remaining at the pinnacle of his prosperity, he felt a peculiar void that no measure of abundance or power appeared to fill. The adrenaline that had once energized him through the hardest of fights, whether in business or individual feuds, started to feel empty. It wasn't that the victories didn't feel great, it was that they at this point not felt enough. When he had first assumed command over the carrier, everything had appeared to be a game, a test to demonstrate his prevalence over the people who had misjudged him. Yet now that he had won, now that he had accomplished the incomprehensible, the triumph at this point not held a similar rush. He vanquished his enemies, gotten his spot in the business world, and constructed a heritage that would keep going for ages. Yet he wound up asking, what comes next? Charles sat at his work area, a heap of reports and corporate notices spread out before him. He had once delighted in the menu of these records, carefully checking the figures, arranging the following vital move. Yet today the numbers appeared immaterial. His psyche floated back to the days prior to the aircraft securing, when his life had been less confounded, when his desire had been unadulterated, untethered by the heaviness of the realm he presently conveyed. It wasn't simply the void that irritated him, it was the acknowledgement that he had become something he hadn't expected to be. His triumph over Jenna, while fulfilling at the time, had turned into a fixation. He hadn't recently taken out her from the business, he had guaranteed her obliteration, and for what? To demonstrate, to highlight, communicate something specific he had done by any stretch of the imagination. Yet was it worth the effort? Charles pushed the reports to the side, reclined in his seat, and gazed through the window. The world was loaded with opportunity, loaded with provokes ready to be handled, but here he was contemplating whether the pursuit was still worth the award. The more he pondered it, the more he understood something he hadn't completely perceived before. He had turned into a man characterized by his triumphs. However, his triumphs had no meaning on the off chance that he didn't have any idea why he was battling. In any case, what wanted to transcend had developed into a need to smash, to rule. Yet now that he had done that, he found himself puzzling over whether this sort of progress was maintainable. Might he at some point keep on battling, assuming the main adversary left was himself? He wanted more than simply power. He expected to find another reason, one that wasn't just about demonstrating his solidarity, however, about discovering a genuine sense of harmony inside his own achievements. Maybe the time had come to step back, to reconsider his life and his needs. However, where to start? Charles chose to enjoy some time off from the determined speed he had set for himself without precedent. For years he considered moving back from the corporate world. Only for a brief period he had the assets to do so. Perpetual cash, a multitude of guides, and a business that could run without him. For some time the time had come to get out of the meeting rooms and methodology meetings and investigate the world according to an alternate point of view. Successful, the thought of a break wasn't so natural as it sounded. Charles wasn't accustomed to standing by. He had gone through his whole time on earth constructing, endeavoring, vanquishing. However, presently the possibility of dialing back appeared to be strangely engaging, so he went with the choice to take a brief break from the monotonous routine, something that would give him the space to reflect, to reconnect with his guiding principle, and maybe sort out the thing was genuinely missing. He booked an excursion to the Caribbean, a spot where he could disengage from the universe of business, where the main things he would need to ponder were the sea and the sky. He realized that a portion of his nearest partners would scrutinize his choice, yet he didn't mind. He expected to do this for himself. The island hushed up, an unmistakable difference to the buzz of Manhattan and the ceaseless commotion of his corporate realm. The delicate sound of the waves running into the shore was relieving also. Without precedent for what felt like always, Charles permitted himself to unwind. He went through his days relaxing on the ocean front, going for long strolls, perusing books he had procrastinated on for quite a long time, and meeting local people who had no clue about who he was. He was simply one more guest in a heaven that appeared to be immaculate by the tensions of the world he had left behind. However, even in this quiet setting, his brain would frequently meander back to the business. He was unable to get away from the annoying inclination that something was missing. It wasn't the domain, it wasn't the acquisitions or the triumphs that had once characterized him. It was the feeling of direction, the drive he had felt when he was building his fortune, when each choice appeared as though it was prompting something more noteworthy. As he sat on the gallery one night watching the dusk, an idea struck him. Perhaps the explanation he felt so unfilled was that he had quit working for building. He had begun playing an alternate game, one that was less about making and more about keeping up with control, about holding power for power. He had become caught by his own prosperity. Might it at some point be feasible to begin once again to take the bits of his domain and make something new, something that wasn't driven by self-image or the craving for strength, yet by something more significant? The idea was both startling and freeing, yet it was a thought worth investigating. Following 7 days of solitude, Charles got back from his excursion with another feeling of clearness. He hadn't completely sorted out every one of the responses, however something had moved during his time away. He saw now that the fulfillment he had been looking for won't come from additional acquisitions or more power. It won't come from making others dread him or constraining admiration through sheer power of will, for whenever he first contemplated individuals he had abandoned the representatives who had been important for his ascent, the one-on who had endeavored to assist him with accomplishing his vision. He had consistently considered them to be instruments as necessary evil, yet presently he was beginning to contemplate whether he had been off base. Imagine a scenario where the genuine worth of his realm lay not in the amount he possessed but rather by the way he treated the people who assisted him with building it. Charles plunked down with his top chiefs and guides and started to re-evaluate the course of the carrier. He wasn't heading to leave the organization he actually accepted in its true capacity. However, he needed to reshape the manner in which it worked to make it more than simply a monetary stalwart. He believed it should represent something for trustworthiness, for regard for development that didn't come to the detriment of others. He began by organizing new administration programs for his representatives. Zeroing in on mentorship and expert advancement, he focused on additional supportable practices in the organization's activities and started pushing for corporate social obligation projects. His counsels were skeptical at first. This wasn't the Charles they had known, the heartless finance manager who thought often just about the reality. Yet after some time they started to see the shift. They saw that Charles wasn't simply attempting to bring in cash any longer, he was attempting to have an effect. However, the change wasn't in the business, it was in Charles himself. He wound up looking for balance in his life, carving out opportunity to enjoy with family, reconnecting with lifelong companions, and in any event, chipping in for purposes he had long overlooked. He realized he was unable to fix the past, yet he could make another future, one that wasn't characterized by success and strength, yet by something more significant: development, reason, and perhaps recovery. As Charles pondered his excursion, he understood that his most prominent triumph wasn't in claiming the aircraft or obliterating his foes, it was in rearming his mankind and keeping in mind that the street ahead would in any case be loaded with difficulties. Without precedent for an extended period of time, he felt like he was going in the correct course as Charles carried out changes in the organization. He saw a change in the manner individuals answered him, the regard that had never been fabricated exclusively on dread was currently beginning to come from something more profound. His leaders, once careful about his more heartless strategies, were starting to trust him again, not on the grounds that they dreaded his power, but since they saw him attempting to assemble something better, something more significant. He wasn't a similar man he had been the point at which he previously assumed command over the carrier. Charles had discovered that power alone didn't make a man solid. It was, How he utilized that ability to lift others. Gradually he started to develop a culture of joint effort, development and opportunity inside the organization. He put more in worker prosperity, sent off drives to reward the networks the airline served, and clarified that nobody, regardless of their position, was over the guiding principle of regard and respectability. However, while Charles had changed, a few old propensities were more earnestly to break. His desire was as yet a main impetus, and however he presently not tried to pulverize his adversaries, he wasn't going to quit growing. The aircraft's prosperity proceeded to develop, and with each new securing or association Charles felt that recognizable rush. Yet this time it wasn't driven by a craving to overcome, it was driven by the test of building something that would last, something that would leave an inheritance. Past abundance. Months passed and Charles' change turned out to be clear. The organization prospered under his new initiative, and he tracked down a harmony among desire and sympathy. His associations with workers, once conditional, had advanced into certified associations. Individuals weren't only working for him, they were working with him. He had at last addressed the inquiry that had tormented him. What comes next? The response was basic development, yet with reason. Charles grasped that achievement didn't come from ruling others, it came from building an establishment that could support itself long after he was gone. As he peered out over his domain, he presently not felt the vacancy he once had. He realized that he could always remember the examples he had advanced, particularly from the flight orderly who had dismissed him from the plane such a long time prior. However, presently, as opposed to considering her to be an image of disregard, he saw her as the impetus for his own change, and that he understood was the genuine triumph. Gratitude for watching. On the off chance that you partook in this story, remember to raise a ruckus around town button, share your considerations in the remarks underneath, and make a point to buy into the feed for more astounding recordings very much like this. See you in the following one.